Hello and welcome to Power People and Planet. I'm Kumi Naidoo, and this is a series of candid conversations with activists and community leaders from around the world tackling some of the most urgent issues that we face. Today I'm really excited. We have two amazing guests, two people who are icons in their regions but also globally. First is Maria Fernanda Espinosa. She's an Ecuadorian diplomat, politician, poet, and I've had the pleasure of listening to some of her poetry, linguist and academic with more than 30 years of experience in international organizations, the Ecuadorian government, and civil society. She served as the president of the 73rd session of the United Nations General Assembly in 2018-2019. You know, that meeting just going on right now, that same one, becoming the fourth woman, only the fourth woman in history to hold that position, and the first woman in Latin America and the Caribbean to hold that position. Previously, she was Ecuador's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Integration, Culture and National Heritage, and Minister of Defense, which she served from 2012 to 2014. She also served as ambassador and permanent representative of Ecuador to the United Nations in New York and Geneva. And as of January 2023, she will serve on the board of trustees of the International Crisis Group. Prior to a political and diplomatic career, she worked as an academic and advisor on biodiversity, climate, and indigenous peoples issues. I'm also joined by somebody I should confess, Maria and I first met when she was president of General Assembly. We didn't know each other, and she was introducing me as the president to address the UN General Assembly. The only time I did address the UN General Assembly on the occasion of the Mandela Peace Summit on Mandela's 100th birthday. And Meena is somebody who I've had the privilege of being in the front lines with, somebody who's inspired me. Both Maria and Meena have inspired me in my own life and work. And Meena, it's always been good to be with you on the front lines in various different forums, even though I hated some of them, like the climate negotiations. But Meena is the president of Sahabat Alam Malaysia, a well-known environmental NGO based in Penang, which works with many grassroots communities, including indigenous peoples, fisher folk, farmers, and rural communities. She has for many years and is currently the legal advisor to the Consumer Association of Penang, another well-known Malaysian NGO that has actually inspired similar organizations around the world that has been advancing the rights and well-being of consumers. She's also the head of programs of Third World Network, an international organization based in Penang, Malaysia, from 2007 till now. And just to say, Third World Network is a global network, and the Africa part of it sits out of Ghana. She's an expert on climate change, especially on global negotiations, including the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and the Green Climate Fund. She has been monitoring and reporting on the negotiations and providing analysis and support both to developing country governments as well as to civil society participants. And maybe Meena might tell us about some of the very tricky games one has to play in negotiations when you sometimes can get what is called a pink badge and you can go in as a government delegate to some of the discussions. So Meena and Maria, thank you so very much for making time to have this conversation. So let's go back to the 1980s, right? I'm sure you both remember this slogan which said, think globally, act locally. Now, what was behind that slogan when it was first articulated in the 80s was irrespective of whatever issue we were trying to address at the local or national level, we needed to better understand how global processes, global institutions, and global power had an impact on what we could or could not achieve at the local level. But one of the ironies of the moment of history we find ourselves is that precisely when many countries in the global south and former Soviet Union were getting democracy for the first time, real power was rapidly shifting from the national to the global levels around many issues. So I'm sure you're familiar and probably participated in DAWN, Development Alternatives for Women in a New Era. In the early 1990s, Devaki Jain from DAWN said, hang on a minute, if we think globally and we act solely locally, and if real power around many issues is shifting from the national to the global levels, then we'll be removing ourselves from where power really lies. And she said, maybe we should turn that slogan upside down and think locally in terms of what our needs are and act globally if that's where power really resides. I think, and I hope you agree, that it's not a question of one or the other. We have to act locally, provincially, nationally, and globally. And we have to do both. So with those, I think what I would really like us to explore is, as civil society, activism, and even governments in the global south, have they got the proportionality right in terms of how much of efforts they put into the UN system and other international bodies, and whether we as effective as we need to be. So let me just pose that as the first question. Do you think we are putting too much of effort and getting too little return from the global system? Or do you think we got the proportionality right, especially from when we look at it from a civil society perspective? Meena.
Kumi, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, and also to meet Maria again, and you, of course. You said that we are inspired you. I mean, South Africa inspired many of us with Madiba and the apartheid, the anti-apartheid movement, and your struggles, and certainly all that is also something that we carry very much in our hearts. Coming to your question, I think you're totally right in the sense that many of us who were working on the local front lines, whether we were fighting the expansion of dams, if you recall, suddenly dams were coming everywhere, indigenous peoples were being displaced, and we were having to respond like firefighting, on these dam projects. And then when we began to investigate, we found that a lot of it was actually due to World Bank funding, and the World Bank was pushing this down our throats. Similarly, with deforestation, we were fighting, particularly for Malaysia, for instance, on the front lines of indigenous people's struggles with the timber, rapacious destruction of rainforests and so on. And then again, we found that a lot of it was actually to supply the timber and the logs for the international markets. And so again, with commodity prices and so on, the Western world was getting very cheap our logs, and the indigenous people had to pay a price. And then while at the same time, if you recall the Rio summit, for many of us, 1990s with the Earth Summit in Rio, where we began to look at development and the environment, and the blame was again on the poor. We saw that you can't blame the poor, because the lifestyles of the rich, they consume much more. Like, I recall 20% of the world consuming 80% of world's resources, while our populations are still, depleted of resources. How can you blame the poor for the crisis of the planet? So how many of us engaged in that international processes to actually flip the discourse, to say that this is not about a population issue, but it's about a consumption issue, it's about a production issue. So this whole thing about changing consumption patterns and production systems, and where we had George Bush Sr. come and say that the lifestyle of the US is not up for negotiation.
Non-negotiable.
Yeah. We remember that.
He said
so
the
very
US
much,
lifestyle is not negotiable.
Exactly. And so basically, I think that has not shifted. So for many of us who were in the front lines of all these struggles, we had no option but to begin to engage at the global level. For otherwise, we would have had policies pushed down our throats from which we cannot recover. And you can have the most progressive government in place, but the policy making would have been made through international institutions. And this is where many of us started to get involved with the World Trade Organization, because the World Trade Organization was beginning to actually shape a lot of the rules of trade, which would basically tie the hands of government. And when many of us started engaging at that international level, it really meant that you have to really look at documents and learn the text and understand the words and the meanings. And many of us were really horrified that many of our governments and don't even know what a particular word meant. First of all, many of them are not lawyers. Secondly, English is not their first language. Thirdly, they are not like the US or the European negotiators who have large think tanks and lawyers on their side. And fourthly, much of these rules are actually designed by the corporates, the large multinationals who sit on the governments, and there's a revolving door in these rich countries where one day you are working for Philip Morris and the next day you are working for you are the USTR, US Trade Representative. So whose agenda are you promoting? And we've discovered that whether it's the tobacco industry, the fossil fuel industry, or these industries, so it was the corporate representation. So I just wanted to say that all these spaces are hugely contested. And the issue is whether the proportionality, I think we can do much better. We need to do much better. And the final word for this, at this juncture, that I will say is that we cannot work in silos anymore, whether you're a trade justice movement or a climate justice movement or a gender justice movement or a tax justice movement. We need to connect them, both north and south. You need the world of the all of us to come together in a much more deeper way, understanding the structural systemic problems and confronting them, confronting the powers that be, particularly in the north, with the support of and the voice of the people in the front line. So I think I'm sure you have other questions to ask, but I can go on and on, but I don't intend to occupy all that space.
No, no, that's a great introductory set of comments, and especially the last point that you made, which is, I think we're in this moment now where I've been saying we need to turbocharge intersectionality, that this working in silos just doesn't. This current moment, one of the things that we need for success is really taking intersectionality to a scale that we've never achieved before. And then, on the optimistic side, I say that even though right now, when people look at what's happening in the world and there's a sense of pessimism, that actually there's never been as big an appetite that I can remember for deep structural and systemic change. So there's something there that I think gives us a sense that this moment, bad as it is, might offer us the best chance for transformative change. What's your reflections, Maria?
Well, first of all, I subscribed every word that Meena said. And I think that we should really have a serious conversation about weaving scales. And because we think that connecting the local and the global and the national, it happens automatically. It does. There is a flux, but it doesn't happen that way. So I think one of the big responsibilities of organized civil society is being deliberate in the way we connect the narratives, we connect the struggles, and we connect the strategy as well. It is not only, and I subscribe the idea of not working in silos, but not working in silos at the scale level. I think we need to connect, how organizations at the community level, are relating to their national politics and policy, and how that informs the international decision-making processes. And back, how the international or global decision-making processes really have a strong impact at the local and community level. And we learned that, during all these years of struggle in different positions. I'm also the typical example of what revolving doors can do, for good and for bad, but to jump back and forth from civil society to government, from government back to civil society, this has been, more than, I would say, 75% of my life, I have been on the other side, and then served as a public servant myself. And then you see, what are the big differences between being in government and having the power. power and government, they don't go together usually, especially if you are a small country in the developing world, highly dependent, in the case of my own country, highly dependent on oil exports for income, and then you have to negotiate even inside your own government and what are the decisions that need to be taken. And when you have a big portion of your people living in poverty, when you don't have a proper health system, public health system, I meant a good quality public education system, where are the resources going to come from? What are the real alternatives? And these are the kind of conversations that need to happen at the multi-scale level. And the other issue is more a conceptual issue. When we say civil society, we tend to think that it's a very monolithic category. And when you say, Kumi, we need to turbocharge intersectionality, I cannot agree more. We need to work across themes, but we also need to understand that the actors are different, that they represent different constituencies, that they are diverse. I have had the privilege to work side by side indigenous peoples for decades. And I know that even within the indigenous leadership, there is big differences of position, of agendas, etc. So I think that we need to have a more granular understanding of the different forms and shapes and big diversity of civil society when we are thinking about strategy and about tactics and about the role of for example, the incredible work that the Third World Network does with Meena and the greatest of the great, Martin Core, which I had the privilege to work with both of you. And believe me, being a climate negotiator for more than a decade, and having the support of people like Meena and Martin means a lot for small countries like ours, because we don't have, as Meena said, the infrastructure so we can take informed decisions and we can bring a more collective voice and power to international negotiations. So it's not really an easy fix. I always say that the climate crisis, the extinction crisis, the debt crisis, the current triple crisis of food, energy, and debt for developing countries, it's really not the problem. These are symptoms of a greater dysfunction of the system. And I think I agree with you, Kumi, when you said I can feel a great appetite for more profound and structural changes. And perhaps that is the kind of conversation we should be having.
So I want to come back to
now.
the question of the system is not working and the system is broken. And let's talk about that in a second. But I just want to make a reflection. I don't think revolving door in itself is a problem where people move between different sectors. And I don't think that's what Meena was saying. I mean, your example of somebody moving from NGOs into government and back, in fact, I think that nourishes governance and society, provided there's transparency. How you got the job in government is clear. There's no, questions about it. What I think is a problem when people hold the highest positions in the corporate sector for a particular corporate entity and then take on positions in government where they are now in the highest levels of the regulatory authority, the regulatory power over the very same industries from where they came from. And that, I think, the United States in particular, and and not to say that this has not happened in other countries, has allowed to happen on a rampant scale. So let's talk about the question then, Maria, that you raise about what about the system is not working, right? So let's talk about the UN as a system first, right? During the Rio Plus 10 summit in Johannesburg, Kofi Annan said, the problem with the UN governance is that it's stuck in the geopolitics of 1945, right? I mean, countries who have, for example, why should the UK and France have a veto today? I mean, there has been superpowers. They, might have been colonial hegemons when the UN was being formed, but today, population size, not the biggest populace, unless you say they must be rewarded because they are holders of nuclear power. Then by that definition, then you have to have India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, and so on the Security Council. I'm just being provocative here because I put it to you, the UN system and the international governance system suffers from four deficits: a democracy deficit, a legitimacy deficit, a coherence deficit, and ultimately an accountability deficit. And much as if the UN and the system didn't exist, we'd have to create it. But let's agree that the system right now is not equitable and not serving the interests of the majority of people in the world. Maria, do you want to respond to that?
First of all, I cannot agree more with you on the deficits of the system. And when the charter was designed and approved 77 years ago, the international geopolitics were dramatically different. Just let's think that when the charter was signed, the signatories were 51 countries, and now we have 193 countries, thanks to the decolonization process and other factors. But just the numbers, I think, that speak by themselves. Just a little bit to derail the question and the conversation about revolving doors, because I think it's very important. I think what Meena meant is the issue of conflict of interest. And which is very clear, you are here and then you serve as a public servant, not to represent the common good and service to the people of your country, but to represent some corporate particular interest. And that happens, everywhere, unfortunately. And we should be very careful, and also to start rethinking about the theory. The theory of the elites, in a way, the anthropology of the elites and how they work for good and bad, and I think that's one of the themes that are out there, and perhaps they need to, more reflection around that. And regarding your question on the UN, the assessment cannot be more accurate. And since I remember, which has been a long time since I worked for IUCN, a long time ago in my previous life, I remember saying, listening that the UN is in the process of reform. So we the organization is constantly, being reformed, and yet the issues of relevance, of efficiency, of really responding to the main challenges of humanity, it's really not working at the pace and that we would like to see. And the difference I see now, compared to when I was ambassador in New York, they started to, there was a decision on reforming the three pillars of the UN: the development pillar, the peace and security pillar, the management pillar, and there was a full package of reforms. The Security Council reform process has been ongoing for 25 years, almost 30 years, and it continues to happen. And I think that what has changed now is that not only, civil society, citizens around the world, but governments have understood that the system is imploding. It's really not delivering as it should. And I think that one of the litmus tests for the multilateral system was the COVID-19 pandemic. And now the war in Ukraine, and the inability of the system to respond. And when I speak about the system, I speak about the multiple UNs that we have, because some people they think that the UN executive arm, the programs and agencies are the UN. But then there is a political UN, there is a parliament in the UN, which is the General Assembly, there is the Security Council, the main organs. There are many UNs within the system, but for a profound structural transformation, you need to bring all the pieces together and see what are the systemic changes that are needed inside the organization. And what I see now is a very vibrant process of ideas, of proposals, of coalitions of organizations getting together. I have the privilege to co-chair a coalition called the Coalition for the UN We Need, with more than 400 organizations from around the world, including think tanks, universities, basically producing ideas on profound structural changes, including, for example, the establishment of a World Parliamentary Assembly, elected representatives to the UN. That's one of the ideas. The other idea that is contained in my opinion, a very ambitious, comprehensive report from the Secretary General, the Our Common Agenda, speaks about repurposing the Trusteeship Council to have the council address issues on the rights of future generations and global public goods. These are the kinds of changes. And then we see, countries that have been in the past very reluctant to any transformation or reform of the Security Council. President Biden, a few days ago in New York, said it is time for a Security Council reform. And I think the wave about the idea of systemic institutional change is gaining traction. We are working as this collective of civil society organizations working towards the Summit of the Future in 2024, this idea of a new pact for the future, and what are the elements that this new pact for the future needs to contain. It's not an easy. There is no band-aid approach, easy fix on this, especially considering the very high polarization, the tensions among the big powers that we are experiencing just now, currently. It's not an easy environment, but I think that there is wide political awareness and commitment and ideas to really push hard for a more structural and profound change.
I mean, your comments also confirm the fact that there appears to be more appetite for much bolder change. But I think we should come back to that, because some will say, well, we've heard it a lot before. It's, to move from the ideas to implementation seems to be the problem, because the most powerful nations in the world who hold disproportionate power right now are reluctant to make the changes and so on. So, Meena, before I come to you, for your reflections on this question, I must note, otherwise I know you're going to shout at me if I don't, that, we shouldn't treat the whole global governance system as one thing. It's not homogenous. I mean, the World Bank and the IMF, I remember one of the first things I heard Martin Kaur say when I heard him speak at the UN General Assembly representing civil society more than 2 decades ago. And I was just very young myself then in the global activism, and he said, the IMF and the World Bank is governed by $1, one vote, just simply that. And he said, the UN, warts and all, still offers us greater possibility of maneuver to advance economic justice, social justice, gender justice, and so on. Your reflections, Meena?
Thank you for recalling what Martin mentioned. And I think that's really spot on. And it's still very relevant today. As bad as the UN may be in some parts of the UN, but if you look at civil society, when we look at rights-based approaches, we rely on the UN, the United Nations, Indigenous Peoples, Declaration, the ILO, all the rights-based approaches came from the UN. It didn't come from the World Bank. It didn't come from the IMF. So I do think that that the issue really is that over the years when we look at the whole globalization process, and I think what we need to really assess is that the Bretton Woods, which is the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and what you see happening, and now, of course, you have the free trade agreements, and the World Intellectual Property Organization, where everything from intellectual property, this whole COVID pandemic exposed the huge inequities that we saw. And they can't even, agree. The world could not agree. The rich powers that be could not agree that you need to actually relax intellectual property over COVID vaccines when human beings were dying. Now, what more will it take? So if you look at the way these institutions actually came into being, not the United Nations, but the WIPO, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the IMF. Now, many of our developing world, we had political independence, but the colonial powers that be and the imperial powers with their neoliberal agenda and with the entire, let's call the system for what it is, the mainstream capitalist system, the Washington Consensus, which actually prevails through these institutions, through the $1 one vote, through the use of rich, powerful governments and the way in which they control this for the agenda of the transnationals. Many years ago, I recall under the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, we were talking about the new international economic order. Today, we want the new international economic order. You will never get it. Now, if you look at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, 1992, after Rio, where you have common but differentiated responsibility, historical responsibility, equity, how developed and developing countries are not on the same starting point. And then even in Paris, how we had to fight to defend the Framework Convention on Climate Change on issues like equity and climate justice and, and all this. It was a huge fight, and still we managed something. But if you want to negotiate these treaties today, you will never get it with equity, historical responsibility, the North-South inequities. The world is the neoliberal, the powers that be have become so right-wing. Like, Maria and I were discussing just before you joined, even to expect Sweden to go right-wing, I never thought I would see that. You had the Scandinavians, you had the Social Democrats of the North who were somehow, they were caring about the world, the Marshall Plan and the idea of social democracy and so on. So something like that existed. But for Sweden to go right wing, for Italy to go right wing, the UK the way it is at the moment, it's just horrendous. This current world we are in. And then when the United States talks about reform, Maria, when Biden talks about Security Council reform, I get worried. It can be the Democrats or the conservatives, but if you look at the WTO, the current administration talks about reform in the WTO. And what they mean is the WTO must respond to the United States agenda. And they have literally paralyzed the World Trade Organization. Now, we used to hate the World Trade Organization and because of all the wrong ways in which it was going and in the kind of agendas that it was pursuing with intellectual property rights and so on. And now you have something worse, which is the free trade agreements, which goes WTO plus, beyond the WTO. So I think the point I'm getting is that the powers that be, the rich world in particular, have used these institutions as their vehicle to entrench the neoliberal agenda and their hegemony. And I think many of our governments are not awakened, or they are paralyzed, because if you, as Martin used to tell us, when you rely on commodities and commodity prices, and when the prices of commodities are dictated by New York and London and wherever, and Tokyo, and when the prices fall, your countries get into debt. When you get a debt crisis, you go to the IMF for rescue. And what does the IMF do? Structural adjustment. Remember, we all went through that. And what did the first thing that they do? They slashed government, public health, education, everything that was public was slashed. And then, and then the whole debt servicing, because you took their debt, you are in trouble because your economic decision making has been mortgaged to their agenda. And this is the same thing that they are doing through the World Trade, through the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. All our governments sign up. And the more you do that, the technical assistance which comes, they are reshaping your intellectual property laws so that you give monopoly rights to the big corporates. And so this continues until today. We are negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's a new IPEF, Indo-Pacific Partnership. So the problem is, if you go into the details of all this, they become so sophisticated. And when we begin to explain to our politicians how dangerous these trade agreements are, they look back at us and they say, surely our governments can't be so stupid. Surely our governments know better. But then I tell you, Kumi and Maria, when we look at the text of these things, that's why when you go into the devil is really in the details. Many of our politicians don't get it. What is the agenda behind this? So I think to cut the long story short, this is a sophisticated game that we are all engaged in terms of a war of power and governance, which actually is about governance in the interest of corporations, not about people. So the little that we have in the UN, whether it's the Framework Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, we hold them dear because these are the only legal instruments which now hold governments to account. And thanks to the credit of Maria and the government of Ecuador, then this in the Human Rights Council, the code, the kind of business rules that are being shaped. The idea of how you can rein in, because I said the new international economic order, that whole UNCTAD, which was trying to be progressive and looking at code of conduct for transnational corporations, that collapsed. And so through the business and human rights, looking at these, trying to revive that, at least that during Maria's time, it advanced. Because at the end of the day, how do you rein in corporate power? And I think that really is, and what are the instruments that they use? I think we need to understand that the agreements and the rules and the intellectual property and the institutions which they use to actually continue control of our countries. So you can have the most progressive government, but your rules, your hands are tied. Just the last point I want to say, Martin used to tell us the story and we couldn't believe it. One government in Africa, for instance, was negotiating something with the United States or some trade agreement, some free trade agreement. And then they said, but sir, we can't do this because our constitution doesn't allow this. So the negotiator from the rich world came and said, we have amended the constitution for you. Here it is. Now you go and implement the constitutional changes. So the dictates which come from the north in terms of changing our constitutions, changing our governments. I mean, I can go on with stories where they even want to change negotiators. In Paris, we've had a hard fight with the like-minded developing countries. Malaysia at that time was championing this, and it was one of our colleagues who was leading that fight. The US did not like our negotiator for what? Because he was, it's not just him, but he was representing the interests of the developing world. But the US said, no, you cannot have anybody smart like this. Then went to our minister and said, please remove him. And they tried to do it. Luckily, they did not manage it because we all intervened. But that's what they do. Even in the Biodiversity Convention and all that, when they have their agenda being, we see through their agenda, we have governments fighting, we have negotiators who want alternative tax. They said, sorry, we have to call capitals, and then we have to remove you because you're not in our agenda. So, I mean, this is what we are at.
Sadly, Meena, I can confirm from my observation and participation in various global UN summits and other WTO and climate negotiations that these things happen very visibly, actually. It's almost in your face. But I just wanted to take us back a little bit, right? And that is, if you look after the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the president of the World Bank, Bill Clinton was president still then, Secretary General of the UN, all said the world needs a new international financial architecture. It was recognized then in 1997 that it was completely broken, right? Then 2008, 2009 happens, the global financial crisis, another sort of warning signal. But the moment the problem was band-aided, it was business as usual. And then when COVID happened, I remember being on a panel with Mary Robinson and Mary saying, this time they won't get away with it. There has to be deep structural and systemic change to address what COVID has revealed. And I said to Mary, I hope you're right. But if I had 50 pounds and I had to bet, will we get it right this time or not, I would bet that the powers that be will hold back change. So in a sense, Maria, that comment connects us to, yes, there are good ideas, both in civil society and progressive governments and even some enlightened elements of business sometimes, about the critical need for us to make big changes very, very fast, given the climate clock that's ticking. But what gives you both optimism that this moment is different? And what would it take for us to get the power, mobilize the power that needs to be mobilized to make sure that this time we go beyond good proposals to implementation, especially with, for example, the question of UN reform, also World Bank, IMF reform, and so on. Over to you, Maria.
On one side, there are this myriad of very creative ideas on the table. There is a lot of global conversation about how to improve the global system, including not only the UN system, but also the current financial institutional framework. So there is lots of vibrant conversations. Your question about how to make it happen, I would say that, and some people say, oh, we need the political will. And yes, we need the political will, but I am more optimistic when I see the power or the transformational power of a strong collective leadership. Of the capacity of building shared narratives, but shared narratives together with strategies, together with specific tactics, alliances that are cross-sectoral alliances. So it's not about these illuminated leaders that are going to change the world. It is about the numbers, the numbers of people that are unhappy with the system that we have. And that includes some governments as well. And let me give you a very small example, but it's a little bit of a symptom that something is changing. There are a series of dialogues now that have started to prepare for the Summit of the Future, to follow the implementation of the Our Common Agenda, a reform report, etc. And there was a conversation, a dialogue on participation and representation of civil society at the UN. And there is a campaign called Unmute Civil Society that perhaps you're aware of. And basically what we saw, and I saw in a very important way, civil society organizations sitting at the same table as many governments, supporting the idea of unmuting civil society and what are the spaces for civil society to make the difference in intergovernmental negotiations. And people as experienced as Meena, you see that there are differences in the space and voice that civil society can have. Even some of the think tanks are more influential than others, etc. But what I see is a conversation going on about how to connect the issue of civil society participation, the issue of legitimacy, of representation, and of efficiency of the system, going back to the 4 or 5 deficits you outlined at the beginning, Kumi. But basically, what we see is now this cross-sectoral dialogue happening. There are many fears from some sectors of civil society saying, the power of the corporate sector, and it's an uneven power balance when you speak about non-state actors. But I think we need to come to grips on the fundamentals, on the base, go back to the basics. I mean, what is that we need and want? And I think that goes to the very basic, even self-preservation instinct that humans are not exercising. Meena gave the perfect example when we were all dying because of COVID. Greed was put on top of everything else. Who cares? But we will not give in on the intellectual property rights on vaccines, for example. And if vaccines are out there, then vaccine hoarding has to happen. I have to have 10 vaccines per person in my country because I have the money to pay, and I can make bilateral deals with companies regardless of the COVAX multilateral facility, etc. On the climate front is the same thing. We're not exercising, our self-preservation instinct. And these are the fundamental things that have to bring us together as humans in a way. And of course, the ideological divide is important. I'm totally with Meena, but we have, when we speak about these potential new social contract or social contracts in plural, we need to start, filtering what are the fundamentals that are going to ensure, self-preservation, and not self-preservation, but self-preservation with dignity, and with a minimum standard of equality, because we know that the inequalities gap has increased in a way that really hurts, because the number of people that are disenfranchised, that do not have a future, that are completely out of the system, are increasing by the hundreds and the thousands every year, and we are responsible for that. We're all responsible, of course. Some are more responsible than others. Common but differentiated responsibilities, as the Climate Convention clearly states.
So, thank you very much, Maria, for that, because that reminds us about the complexity, in a way, of the moment that we find ourselves. Because on the one hand, ideally, this convergence of crises, boiling point, perfect storm moment that we're in should move us to sanity and to recognize that only if rich and poor countries act together, for example, will we be able to get a situation where we can secure all our children's futures. Right now, the competitive nature, and I think, the vaccine apartheid that we saw showed us that actually, when push comes to shove, people in the global south will be sold down the tube, right? We will be abandoned and so on. And when we look at the climate crisis, what's desperately difficult about that is that the people that are paying the first and most brutal price are the ones that have contributed least to the problem. In fact, it is our brothers and sisters in the global north and their government's leadership that led to overconsumption, overdepletion of everything, and so on. So within this context, I want to raise a bit of a difficult question, right? And that is, it is now largely accepted that some of our most well-known and well-respected NGOs, international NGOs, some of whom I've worked for, must concede that they are deeply structurally racist, right? In the sense that they still carry the identities, the values, the staffing, everything looks like, none of our international NGOs look like how the world looks like, right, on the one hand. But then I put it to you that when we look at the UN system, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on, aren't these institutions also overtly and fundamentally structurally racist? And therefore, by that I mean who controls the decision making, who controls on every levels, from budgets and so on. So the question that I want to pose is, are the right voices from civil society? And Maria, you can reflect on it from somebody who's also been on both sides, but I'd like you to reflect on this question as when you were in the UN system, for example, when you engaged with civil society, were the right kinds of voices of civil society engaging with you from your experience? What I'm saying by that is that quite often the sense we have is that, yes, there's a lot of engagement, but quite often voices from the global south, for example, are very, very marginalized. Meena, can I come to you first and then come to Maria after that on this question?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a very important question, but I wanted to reflect on this race issue as well. Racist, and you're talking about institutional racism as well. But I must tell you, Kumi, there is a racist. We have to look at the racist issue, but we also have to look at the
Class issue?
the class issue. I was about to say that, the class issue as well. And if you look at, I just give you one example, the World Trade Organization, because we are very familiar with that from the Third World Network side. What the previous director generals could not deliver was delivered by a Nigerian director general, a woman, and that from Nigeria. Now, you can Google her name. I can never get her name right exactly. Ngozi. But you see,
Ngozi.
It was very untransparent. It was very manipulated. And we were, someone who you would have thought would have represented the interest of the South did not represent the interest of the South. So for me, that it's not just about race, or it's about class, and it's also about where our people of the South are educated. And this brings me to the issue of the colonial mindset. Many of our, we talked about all these institutions, but and the paradigm that is shaped. Many of our institutions, our education systems, our elite are actually educated in the North, and the West is fantastic. They have done it. They, what was that? What's that famous book? Black Skin, White Masks. Yeah. Who wrote that again? I forgot. Come on. I mean, I'm getting old, and it'll come back to me. So this whole issue.
Frantz Fanon?
Frantz Fanon.
Wasn't it Frantz Fanon?
Yes, it was Frantz Fanon. You think you have the right people with the right color, but no, it's not there. Look at the chancellor in the UK right now. I mean, it's a Nigerian. Oh, sorry, where is he from? He's from Africa, right? He's a chancellor, but he's a Brit. So, and I don't think it's just about color as well, but it is important. The racism is very connected to colonialism, very deeply connected to the kind of people that are shaped in terms of their mindset. So coming back to your question, are the right people at the table? So for me, the issue really is that we have to have the right people at the table, but what does that mean? And what is the responsibility that brings? And civil society still, by and large, like if I just take the UNFCCC space, we had just a huge discussion. We had the Climate Action Network and we had the Demand Climate Justice Network. For the longest time, when the Climate Action Network was actually launched, it had a lot of progressive civil society, both from the North and the South, Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace and all the big logos, but very progressive at that time. Even some of us were in there. But after a while, many of us left that space because it began to do more technical stuff, and because it was all about Kyoto. And then we left that space. And that space was actually hijacked by much more conservation-oriented NGOs who had no idea about, colonialism, slavery, inequality, justice, nothing. So they came with a very, very conservative agenda. And good people, because it's about the environment, it's about the panda. It was not about the people, though, because they didn't understand that. So I think we lost that space, and we had to come back and reclaim. So today, I mean, just a few months, just last month, we had a huge meeting of the leadership of CAN and the Demand Climate Justice, and we were analyzing the more that the southern progressive voices are out there, are in there, who are able to do this, the better it would be. And I think this is where our challenge is, because a lot of us are not resourced. Because if you're radical like this, Kumi, nobody's going to fund you, as you know. You know, the last thing in the world, your own governments make it hard for you. They don't not only fund you, they make it very difficult. Like, you know, the environmental rights defenders, we are put in jail because we're protecting the forest. I mean, you know, we're dealing with governments like that as well. And so at the international level, so if we have to engage, we need to actually have a lot more resources and capacity. We need to really pass on that. Many of us are, like in my own organization in Third World Network, where's the next generation? You know, Kumi, you are gone, I am gone, Maria gone. Who's going to, you know, not that we are the only people in the world, but I think that there is really a lot that we need to do in terms of making sure that the right people are there. We have to make it happen. And so none of this comes easy, but it's about struggle that we continue to struggle with. And the last point I want to make is that what is it that is the moment that change? I think the collapse is also, I mean, it's not only in the South. The South, of course. The one thing about the South, Kumi, our poor people, you know, either they're
Have
used
resilience.
the resilience, and they're also very used to dying. You know, I mean, for them, even
Sadly.
if there is no fan or air conditioner, you and I are different. I go to an indigenous house in Sarawak, in East Malaysia. I don't have a sit-in toilet. I struggle, but you know, they are fine. I mean, they can live with very little. But I think the problem for us is that the poor are much more resilient. But that doesn't mean you continue to allow them to be, you know, in that way and to despair. But the point I'm raising is that it's collapsing even in the north. And so, unfortunately, there's so much of vacuum that even the north, even in Europe and so on, I mean, the same system, elite, I hate to use this word, but I will use it nevertheless, screws everybody, screws the poor, whether it's in the north or whether it's in the south, the inequality that Maria talked about. So how do we connect them to know that, you know, your future and my future are connected? And, you know, this is not because the Chinese, you know, it's not the Chinese who have taken away your jobs. It's the corporations who have taken away your jobs. So this whole, you know, this conversation that Maria and I were having also, why is it that the poor vote the right? Very deep question. Why is it that the poor vote the right? Populists, all the wrong leaders, even in the South. I miss the leadership of the South. We can blame the North as much as we want, but where are the enlightened leaders of the South? And we are hoping that Latin America will produce a lot more of that leadership, because there's some shining hope that is coming from that part of the world. So we need that leadership. We need the leadership of governments. We need the leadership of the like-minded civil society. We need the leadership of course, the movements. We need the connectedness of the North and the South as well, because we are all in this together. And I think that we cannot vacate and let the right occupy that popular discourse. We need to reclaim that discourse. We need to reclaim that space. It's a long, hard work. And then we'll have to ensure that we are there in the right spaces.
Thank you so much, Meena. We believe it or not, we're almost running out of time. So before I go to Maria to reflect on it, I want to stay with you though and just ask you the one homework question I gave you, which was, so clearly we are in a situation where we need massive changes. Clearly there needs to be a different kind of mobilization, and we need to try to rebuild the broken commitment between governments and people at the national level, but also at the global level. But if you were to be given the power to draft one clause in every country's constitution that you think is the most important thing for you that should be in any social contract, what would that be?
Well, I heard that you said participation and was it access and freedom of participation, was it?
Participation.
Yeah, for me, that's not
Yeah.
enough. That's just the most basic. It's not enough. It's transparency, it's accountability, and it's decision making which puts, I hate to sound very what you call cliche, but the interest of the vast majority of the poor and the planet ahead of corporates. I think that really is what we need to see. At the end of the day, we need all of us that kind of transparency, accountability, and representation. Who are we speaking for? Are we speaking for the rich or are we speaking for the poor? And I think that's really important.
If I were to summarize your clause in few words, it'll be people before profit, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a short way. Thank you so much, Meena. Coming to you, Maria, give you further your reflections on the earlier conversation, and then conclude with your clause in the social contract. What would that be?
Well, I think that our world is marked by complexity, and I think that we should, take responsibility for that complexity in a way. Responsibility in terms of redesigning the narrative. I think words matter. When we say, civil society participation, well, who do civil society represent? What is the agenda? Who do we need to have at the table? In really unravel what the term civil society means. The same goes when we say the global south. The world is not, the poor people, disenfranchised people, rightsless people, live in all parts of the world today, unfortunately. And when we say the global south, the BRICS are the global south, or what is the model, and sometimes we tend to essentialize the global south as that's where the good comes, and it's really more complex than that, and I think that to be assertive, to understand what our collective strategy for our theory of change has to be. We need to bring in this complexity, and to be more granular in the ways we act in a very modest way, as a citizen like myself, as a head of the Third World Network, or as an voice of influence like yours, Kumi. But we need to understand what the context is to be more assertive, to rethink. I come again to this, the theory of the elites, the anthropology, the ethnography of the elites, in how not to just ignore them, but just how to deal and negotiate dissent and struggle with the elites, because they're not going to stop to exist because we want. It doesn't happen, unfortunately. Reality is like that, and so there is no, again, like a band-aid approach to the multiple pains that the world is suffering. And that's why I am coming back to this idea of what are the fundamentals, the self-preservation fundamentals that we need to bring in. And here I perhaps end by saying, what would be the clause in this social contract? I would like to use words of a great friend and mentor of ours, perhaps, at least for me, Kumi, which is Harsh Mandal. He taught me, at least, the power of radical love. The theory of change has to have an umbrella of radical love for humankind, and radical love for nature. This would allow, there is no social contract, again, with 10 ticking the boxes menu. It's about reconciling as a species, and reconciling with nature. Perhaps the crisis is so profound, and so destructive, that we need a moment of reconciliation and a moment of radical love. And this perhaps may sound, naive because there's so many structural determinants, but it boils down to that, how to mend, how to restore the broken relationship between politics, the economy, nature, and rights, and a human, dignity centered kind of theory of change, under the idea of radical love. So I don't know how you write
Yes.
that, in a new pact for the future, in a new social contract. But I think, and I don't want to seem esoteric or anything, but these are the kinds of conversations that we I think we need to
Maria,
have.
that was perfect ending to our conversation. Let me just say that not only do we need to, I think, embrace things that might not be seen as conventional, like the notion of radical love, but we also have to be willing to dream and dare to be fundamentally different, because we have to refuse to accept that the world that we live in is the best that humanity can design for itself. And more so, we need to understand that the window of opportunity to avert even a worse climate crisis is narrow and closing. So to the people that are listening and viewing this conversation, each of you will need to make your own decisions about where you put your energies, whether you want to work at the local level, national level, or global level. But it's not that any of us are making a value judgment about one is being more important than the other. But with regard to the level of global engagement, you will need to make your own judgment about how you participate, if you participate, whether you participate through others. But I think overall, we want to see those people that are in the front lines of different struggles having the voices at the global level as much as possible, and it not being mediated through voices of privilege. In closing this conversation, I didn't plan to do this, but I want to, with your permission, actually dedicate this podcast to two people who I think we all hold in very, very high regard, and many young activists might not know of them, but they should know about them because they are some amongst the most inspirational that we've had. So I'd like to dedicate this podcast firstly to Ashmanda, an activist from India, a homeless activist, a person who stood up against Islamophobia and so on, and who, in the same way as he inspired you, Maria, he has inspired me and given me a lot of strength for the struggles that I have to deal with right now. And lastly, the second person is somebody who I used to love whenever I was in meetings with him at the UN, or, this important people meetings, as I used to call it. I used to always, sometimes people introduce themselves and say, I'm the chief economist of the World Bank. And I used to enjoy saying, oh, by the way, meet Martin Koh. He's the chief economist of the global economic justice movement. And I'd like to close this episode by paying deep tribute to Martin Koh for all that he contributed when he was with us, and to Ashmanda, who continues to fight the good fight in India. So for those of you who've been watching, please share, I don't know, all those things you have to do, like and so on. Please spread the word, share this podcast widely, and do send us any comments that you have. Thank you very much once again to Maria and to Meena for not just being on this podcast, but for a lifetime of contribution to justice, equity, and peace. Thank you so much for all that you've done, and all that I know you will still do, because the struggle for justice is a marathon, not a sprint. Thank you so much.